Hi, Hi Rock. My name is Megan, and I'm glad to be with you today as we continue in our sermon series, What's New?, where we're exploring Mark's Gospel and Jesus' offer for a new life. There's something spacious about the new year, I've found. Maybe it's the new planners or the purging of the closets and toys in my house after Christmas. Literally making space in the house is so cathartic to me. But this year, I'm aware of other kinds of space too. I had cleared my calendar for knee surgery and the subsequent recovery, so I felt like I came into this new year with a literal blank slate. I was so excited then to engage in this practice that I started a few years ago. Every season, I ask God who and what I should be investing my resources in, my time, my money, my energy. It allows me to be intentional and to try to honor my limits. But this year, I felt an uncomfortable tension. I realized the spaciousness that I felt existed because there was nothing planned with certain family members. This is atypical because the last few years have had a lot of time with this group. But some of the relationships have changed. There are more noticeable differences where there used to be similarities. There's suspicion where there used to be trust. And there isn't really a clear path forward. And in some cases, there's been an expressed desire to not move forward together. Right now, I feel like we're left with two options. Number one, ignore our differences and pretend like nothing is wrong for the sake of unity. Or two, ignore each other and cut one another off for the sake of our sanity. Honestly, I don't really like either of these options. They're not healthy or restorative. I understand that I have a higher conflict tolerance than other people, but for me, actually enduring those conflicts and differences is core to the gospel. I love getting to the bottom of disagreements with folks, asking hard questions and staying in the messy spaces that remain unresolved. I think that that's moving towards reconciliation, and that's a big part of why I love serving at High Rock. Our whole mission about creating unlikely communities of people following Jesus together means that I get to have hard, reconciling conversations for a living. But even as I was dissatisfied with the options of ignoring the problems or ignoring the people, I'll admit that figuring out another way forward felt exhausting. My calendar might be empty, but in large part because of these fractures, my relational tank is feeling empty too. Can you relate to that? Feeling empty? Depleted by relational tension? Are you just tired of tension in relationships? We saw conflicts bubbling under the surface for years, but the beginning of the pandemic surprisingly brought us all together. We were all in this mess together, but that glow of being in pandemic solidarity seemed to last for just a week before we were at each other's throats again. These deep fissures in our society reflect the divisions in many of our families, too. To make sure our family relationships aren't threatening like the world, we do what we can to manage them. We either ignore potential tripwires, like no politics or religion at the dinner table, or ignore the people who cause tension. Maybe you don't cut others off, but you do stop putting energy in there, and you let things just drift away. It doesn't cost you that much. Because the fear is for us that when we actually lose family relationships or those relationships that are like family to us, it's going to cost us everything. When any of us are born, our families are our first source of identity. At their best, they're places that nurture growth and offer us a place of belonging and security when we run into the scary stuff in the world. A secure family is so important that when we don't have a family of origin that nurtures and protects us, we create chosen families. As we grow older, we expand our families by adding more people like us, people that look like us, vote like us, think like us, people that are safe and provide us with a sense of security and identity. If we want to stay in, we either fall in line with the way that the group is, or we find a new group to be with. But y'all, we know that it's not that simple. None of us are static. At a certain point, any family that's held together through sameness and the exclusion of those who are different will crack. The kind of family that can't weather changes. When we don't talk about Bruno, the house is going to start to crumble. Churches split when new questions get asked and raised. Politicians and voters form new caucuses, which fracture their own parties. So we know that ignoring differences or ignoring people doesn't work, and it seems to be killing us. Does Jesus' new life offer anything beyond the survival of the fittest family or the strongest member? Or is Jesus' family really just another form of social Darwinism? I wonder if that's the question in our text today. We find Jesus in the beginning of chapter 3 moving through the community, shaking up his family of faith and his family of origin. Pastor Dave shared how Jesus healed a man on the Sabbath, a day where there was no work to be done. There were religious leaders that watched him do this so that they might discredit him, and it was the final straw for some of them. They began their plot to kill him. Why though, right? He just healed a ton of people, cast out demons. Shouldn't that be celebrated? But now these Pharisees are trying to kill Jesus? I feel like we need to pause and offer some sympathy to these guys. The Pharisees were a religious sect that were dedicated to keeping the law of Moses as a way of staying devoted to God. They emerged in the years between the Old and New Testaments, when Jewish people were adopting more and more Greek customs. Israel's entire history to this point was this story of God's people continually giving in to the temptation to live according to the world's ways instead of God's ways. So these Pharisees just wanted things to be made right. And they believed that if all of Israel were committed to the law like they were, that God would save them from the empires that oppressed them. And so they followed the law to the letter. They didn't eat with sick people or known sinners. And it wasn't because they innately hated those people, but because the law forbade it, and such people threatened their law-following agenda. They believed that God's family and their way of life had to be defended at all costs. Protecting those in the family was essential. Their salvation was at stake. And don't we hear echoes of that today? That we need to defend our way of following Jesus because other ways are dangerous to us and our salvation? To be fair, the Pharisees didn't have issues with Jesus' healing people. But Jesus forgiving sins, like he did with the paralyzed man in chapter 2, that was dangerous. It was blasphemy, literally disrespecting God. That put the entire family of God, all of Israel, at risk. God might smite them, or the Romans might oppress them further. That's a big risk to take on one guy. Jesus went from being one of us to being one of them in the eyes of the Pharisees. But Jesus couldn't be ignored. He was leading a growing movement. This movement had a competing vision for God's people that threatened the whole approach of the Pharisees. They kept people out who were sinners to try to save some, because it's better than nothing, right? But Jesus came to invite sinners into God's family, to save all. For the religious leaders, this could have devastating consequences. The Pharisees are asking people to choose piety, but to them, Jesus is leading people down a path that looks like sin and death. And this is the scene when Jesus comes back home. There's so many people following him that there's no space to eat. He has no time to stop and eat. Jesus has now become this huge threat to the religious leaders' plans to save God's people. And when someone's a threat, they must be removed. So they accuse him of being the prince of demons. Now, this kind of accusation could typically sink a traveling teacher like Jesus. By calling him demonic, the Pharisees are trying to label Jesus as an outsider, as an enemy. But actually, his followers were surprisingly not dissuaded by this. Many of them like Jesus because he welcomes outsiders in his family of faith. While the Pharisees express concern for the salvation of the whole nation of Israel, their legalism doesn't actually leave room for the care of these outsiders. What the text says is remarkably little, actually, about Jesus' dynamic with his family of origin. I wonder if that's because Jesus' contact with his family of origin at this time was sparse. Maybe the way that Jesus was promoting division in his family of faith was causing fractures among his family of origin. And so when they tell him to stop talking, I think that they're actually trying to protect him and them from being cast out or killed by the religious figures. They're trying to restrain him from putting himself in more danger and to stop him from shaming their family. If he continues to preach this way, what are people going to think about them? This has the potential to destroy them too. But Jesus rejects this premise. How could he be a demon? How could he be shaming them if he has actually just been destroying demons? Why would he do that? Families don't destroy each other, right? I mean, ideally, no, but we're human. We do it to each other all the time. Have you ever had a person that you're close to change and it felt like betrayal? You might have felt angry at first. Maybe you're still angry. But maybe under that, you're also sad or worried. Maybe you think that they're going astray, making choices that are hurtful to themselves or to others. If you're a parent, maybe you feel like everything that you've worked for is now being put in jeopardy. think it's justified to feel scared when people change how they're following God. We've seen how manipulative religious cults can be. I mean, we don't want that for our people. And when I don't understand those changes, it can be scary. And I think it's also okay to feel hurt when we believe that we've been betrayed. When there's been one way that our family behaves or presents itself to the world, and then that changes. In some families, there's a certain person who carries that authority and influence in a family. They get to say what goes. And if someone else challenges that, it can be very disorienting. The way that our world frames difference and change can make someone who felt like family feel more like an enemy. It doesn't feel normal to feel this disoriented. And when this happens, I want to stop the person that I love from harming themselves. Or I want them to stop embarrassing me. Or perhaps it's a way that they're responding to me changing. I'll start to ask questions about if I still belong, if I'm still loved. I want to make sure that if they're responding negatively to my changes, that they won't end up harming me. When this has happened in my life, I'm often not aware that there's this new insecurity about my relationship with someone right away. I can tell that I just feel scared. Whether I'm insecure because I'm unsure about someone else or wonder if they're unsure about me, if I'm not aware of that fear of possible harm, it can end up spilling out in nasty ways. Fear can drive me to demonize someone who used to be family. Fear can drive me to want to blame them for everything without taking responsibility for my own stuff in our relationship. I felt that way when I started asking questions about the intersection of faith and politics in my late teens. I assumed that because my parents had voted a certain way that when I thought differently, I'd just be written off. At first, I didn't want to bring it up. I ignored our differences. But soon I was tired of not being able to be myself around them, or not being able to have meaningful conversations with them. I loved them. I wanted to talk about this stuff. And because this was all a part of following Jesus for me, I had to bring it all up. But I was so worried that they'd react negatively, that they'd think that I was attacking them. Even though I just wanted to invite them into my own journey, I ended up not really handling it well, right? Like as a teenager, I didn't know how to have these conversations well. And so I ended up setting unhealthy pattern for conversation. And later, even though I had new tools for dialoguing, it ended up being a bit of a disaster when Donald Trump was elected president. Already tense relationships became more strained whenever we tried to talk about politics and faith. It didn't work for me to ignore our differences to preserve unity, and I didn't want to ignore them for the sake of sanity. Neither are great, but those were the options that the world gives us. Families shouldn't destroy each other, but it happens all the time. So Jesus' family, back in our text, tries to stop him, to call him back to fitting in with them, to being a part of this safe family of God that will be saved and protected by God and the religious leaders. But friends, Jesus has a new vision of who's family, of who's worth protecting and worth saving. The text tells us, then Jesus' mother and brothers arrived. Standing outside, they sent someone to call him. A crowd was sitting around him, and they told him, your mother and brothers are outside looking for you. Who are my mother and my brothers? He asked. And then he looked around at those seated in a circle around him and said, here are my mother and brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brother and sister and mother. The religious leaders wanted Jesus to ignore the differences and fall in line for the sake of Israel. His family wanted him to ignore the people who followed him for the sake of their family. But Jesus chooses a new way. He doesn't ignore the differences or the people. He is aware. He's aware of God's vision for his family. It's marked not by blood or familial allegiance or to the survival of a way of life. It's marked by the waters of baptism in the Holy Spirit. I think that's part of why he gets baptized in the beginning of Mark, to show that he was starting this new family as God's son. All of those that through the power of the Spirit do God's will are in his family. Jesus is aware of his own limits. We see the places where he chose to rest and sleep and have fun and spend time in prayer. This shows up in who Jesus invests his time in. Jesus doesn't ignore anyone on his journey, right? We see him engaging with the most marginalized and the most powerful, but because he was aware of God's vision, we see him investing in the people that were on the same journey as him. He would stop and talk to the Pharisees. In this case, he'd answer their questions and invite them to come along. He didn't ignore them. But when they wouldn't listen, or join him, Jesus stayed anchored in the family that was moving with him towards God's purposes. Even as he moved with these willing folks, Jesus was aware of the limits of those around him. He knew that they were humans with limits too. Remember, he was the physician coming to save the sick, not the healthy. He answers people's questions patiently. And he tries to use different parables to help communicate with them because he understands that this journey that his family is on is a hard one to comprehend, much less live out. Because even as this family will do good and will bring life, Jesus is aware that it will be costly. The world and Jesus are at odds with how we can navigate differences in our relationships. So friends, what will we choose? The world tells us that costs are worth paying when they benefit us. It makes love transactional. But Jesus invites us to participate in a love that is unconditional, a love that loves God and our neighbor. The world tells us that our families have to ignore our differences in order to have a strong identity. But Jesus' family embraces the differences that exist between how they seek to love God and others as beautiful reflections of God's creation. We love these differences because they help us love God more. The world tells us that we have to ignore people outside of our family because we have to focus our time and our energy and our finances on ourselves first so that we can survive. But Jesus' family calls us to love those outsiders as much as we love ourselves. The world tells us that our security and belonging is predicated on being beneficial, that somehow we have to do good in order to receive good. But Jesus' family is grounded in unconditional love that tells us that we always have worth, belonging, and a place to call home. God's vision for family can be inclusive of insiders and outsiders because God is love. The world's version of love ceases when someone breaks the role that they've been given or steps out of line. But because God is love, nothing can stop God's love for you, for me, and for every other person in this world. Jesus came because of this unchanging, abundant, and embracing love. Instead of ignoring how people went on their own way instead of God's way, instead of ignoring people and leaving them to their own destruction, God chose to be aware of our lives fully through the incarnation. Jesus showed us what is possible when we love each other in the way that God loves us. Communities can be restored, relationships can be reconciled, and the divisions of the world will be nullified. This is huge stuff. And even though I'm finite and I can't fix it all, God is inviting me to a faithful response when it comes to my own family. I would invite you to consider how these might be helpful for you too. I'm using my calendar as a tool of examination to help me see how I'm using my resources, my time, my money, my energy. When I look at my calendar, I'm choosing to be aware, like Jesus. How many of my commitments are ones that just build me up, with people that are easy for me to love? If most of your time is just being with easy people, it might be because you don't have any relational energy left for anything else. Maybe it's because of your job or being overprogrammed. I find that when I'm depleted, I spend more time like this because I'm seeking safety and security. It's harder to risk the little free time that I do have. Jesus was grounded in God's love, so his safety and security was in God, not in other people or other sources of affirmation. It allowed him to go out to people that were different than him. Consider how you can free up more relational energy to love those who are more outside for you. What activities do you need to pare down or cut out? Check where you're spending your energy. Perhaps you're all in on God's vision for family. We've preached about this consistently for the last 2 years, and you've seen the life that can come from living this way. But maybe the relationships that you had from before you followed Jesus like this have become strained as a result. Family and friendships that were once easy are more costly now. Perhaps, like me, you've experienced a total loss of relationship. Be aware of those changes too. Old rhythms might not be sustainable anymore. We see Jesus, grounded in God's vision, invite his family to come with him. But he didn't spend extra time or energy when they didn't want to follow. He doesn't exclude them, but he doesn't go back to how things were because that would have prevented him from the expansion of God's family that he was called to. He set boundaries to protect his mission. This was part of how things got repaired with the family member that disagrees with me on how faith and politics work themselves out. I had to embrace different ways of interacting with them. I apologized for the ways that I had previously been hurtful, and I asked if we might try to treat each other with love. I set new boundaries. I wouldn't take on the bait that if they tried to attack me, and I would decline to talk about things if either of us wasn't in a good place to talk about hard things. For me, I was embracing a new way of connecting with this person, doing so only when I felt grounded enough in God's love to set aside my ego and my need to be right, my need to feel strong. And while it's been hard, it has made a difference. This new way of loving has allowed me to see my family member not as an enemy, but as a person that I love. And thanks be to God, we are in a much better place where we can both offer each other curiosity and respect. I was recently with them and we had so much fun because we weren't so on guard with each other. Adjustments with folks that we've once had a strong relationship with can be the most painful. We can see the possibilities for a deeper love and connection with these folks that we love, but friends, you can't make people choose Jesus. You can't force people to love you sacrificially. Let me say that again for you. You cannot make people choose Jesus, and you cannot force people to love you sacrificially. You just can't. But what I can do is invest that time in praying for those people and entrusting them to God. I don't close the door to more relationship in the future, but part of being finite and faithful is being aware that if I'm depleted from the people who don't want that with me now, I can't be faithful to others that God puts in my path who would want to be with me. Once I'm aware of my resources and I discern where God is inviting me to invest, I talk with a small group of trusted people who are on the journey with me. These people share God's vision for family. They act as a gut check. They help me set good boundaries. They sacrifice for me and for others in costly ways. It reminds me that I can continue to sacrifice too. They are a reminder of God's unconditional love and an encouragement when the cost of loving people that are hard starts to add up. So I need to be intentional about investing in some of those relationships too. If you're someone who attends worship on Sundays but aren't in a small group where you're known more deeply, I encourage you to connect with your congregational pastor or director. These groups are our anchors because being in God's family isn't something that we do on our own. No, we need each other so that together we can start to be aware of others in our world. I do have a word of warning for you though. Pay attention to if your small group has become more of a social gathering. There isn't anything wrong with having Christian friends that we enjoy. But sometimes our small groups create new insular families that take up all of our time and energy, and they don't allow us to be aware of what new people God is inviting us to invest in. A small group that's thriving will be encouraging and challenging each other and then probably breaking up to multiply their impact with new people. God's family is continually expanding and including new people. Our relationships with each other need to reflect that. The world is going to continue to pit people against people, family against family, and nation against nation. The world will tell us that we need to ignore our differences or ignore each other in order to survive. But Jesus invites us to journey with him in love, noticing that we have more in common with the sinners that we pass on the road than we might admit. In the love that we offer for our neighbor, we embody the love of God, who was aware of us when we were still sinners and died for us. So friends, take heart. This new family, grounded in the love of God, includes you, and we're better for it. May God use our church to invite more people into this reality. Thanks be to God.